And yeah, this scene in the movie, it was just so intense and like electrifying and exhilarating. And it was just, it was incredible. I don't want to like oversell it, but it was amazing. Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, published in 1981. And I'm comparing it with two different adaptations. So we have Manhunter from 1986, directed by Michael Mann. And then I will also be talking about the 2002 movie Red Dragon, directed by Brett Ratner. And this was also adapted as part of the Hannibal TV show back in 2013. But I have not watched that TV show, so I will not be talking about that adaptation of this story. So yeah, I'm sure I will get comments saying how incredible the show is and that I have to check it out. And I do plan to, but to be honest, is not anytime soon. But yeah, this was the first book Harris ever wrote featuring the infamous Hannibal Lecter, and the second book in his Lecter series was The Silence of the Lambs. And Manhunter, this movie came out before the movie The Silence of the Lambs, so in this version, Brian Cox plays Hannibal Lecter, whereas in the 2002 Red Dragon movie, we have Anthony Hopkins reprising his role, and Red Dragon was Hopkins' third and final time playing Lecter. And this might be blasphemous to say, but between these two movies, I'm not talking about Silence of the Lambs, between these two Red Dragon adaptations, I think Brian Cox gives a better performance as Lecter than Anthony Hopkins did in Red Dragon. Like, there's a scene where he's on the phone with a secretary trying to get information. And if you watch those two scenes back to back, I think it's pretty clear that the Brian Cox version in Manhunter is just so much better, at least in my opinion. So I'm just coming right out the gate saying potentially controversial things, but let me know your thoughts down below in the comments on how you feel about Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter here in Manhunter. Because yeah, I thought he was fantastic. And then also, this is a subscriber request. So this was requested by Brown Hulk 2344 as well as Amber Gerber 5162. So they specifically requested this one, but then also C Dolan 13, they also mentioned this book and its adaptations in a previous video I had made. So yeah, I hope all three of you enjoyed this video, and be sure and share your thoughts down below. And it's funny because specifically when Brown Hulk requested this, initially I replied being like, no, I'm not doing that. Because books about serial killers, I just find too disturbing and upsetting, and it's too real, right? And so that's not a topic I gravitate towards. And also Hannibal Lecter, I'm just like, I don't want to read anything in the Lecter universe. So initially I told them no, and yet I still went and looked into the book after they requested it. And for some reason, I guess I was feeling crazy, feeling a little wild. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to give this a shot. And I'm really glad I did, because I did like this book quite a lot. And The Silence of the Lambs used to be a book and movie combo that I had on my figurative never going to cover list. And yet, I mean, I know I'm going to get comments being like, oh, now you have to do The Silence of the Lambs. And yeah, I definitely plan to now, because after reading this by Thomas Harris, my first Harris book, I definitely want to read more by him. So as far as when my Silence of the Lambs video will be up, that is TBD. It won't be anytime too soon, unfortunately, unless this video does really well, and if I get an overwhelming amount of comments saying they want to see Silence of the Lambs sooner rather than later, then I will try to do it early 2025. But yeah, anyway, I just thought it was funny that this was a genre and a topic and a specific character whose books I was never interested in reading. I mean, I've seen the movie, The Silence of the Lambs, but I've just never read the book. Anyway, and yet now here I am saying I'm going to cover it. So I guess you just never know. And now let's get into the details of the plot, which means we will have spoilers for all three going forward. So all three follow the same basic plot, where we have Will Graham, who is the guy who caught Hannibal Lecter and who had him arrested. And now, some years later, he has retired, but he is brought back into the business because there is a new serial killer on the loose who has killed two families. And Will has a special talent for getting in the heads of killers, and so they ask him to come back and help with this investigation so he can help catch this new serial killer. And the press has titled this serial killer as the Tooth Fairy because he leaves a lot of bite marks. And during the investigation, Will decides that he needs to go see Hannibal Lecter because he feels like he needs to get the scent and just get in that headspace. And so from here, throughout the story, he does communicate with Lecter a bit, but he tries to limit on how much he's talking to him for the most part. And then we also get the perspective of the killer. So we find out that he is a man named Francis Dolarhyde who works at a photo/video processing place. And the way he finds the families he will kill is from these home videos that are sent in to be processed. And after the first 2 murders, we see him start to date a woman he meets at work. So it is a blind woman named Reba, and her genuine attraction and interest in him causes unexpected changes within Dolarhyde. And we see that he has an obsession with one of the paintings of the Red Dragon by William Blake, and he thinks he is becoming the dragon, and he also thinks that the more people he kills, the more he will change and become this other entity, like this god. And before Reba, yeah, the dragon was someone he was becoming. But then after he and Reba, after they have sex for the first time, which by the way, gross detail, but in the book, we learn that this is his first time ever having sex with a living woman. But yeah, so after this happens, then suddenly the dragon becomes this separate entity from Dolarhyde, and the dragon tells him that Dolarhyde needs to kill Reba. However, Dolarhyde genuinely cares for Reba, so he is trying to save her from being killed by the dragon. And so while Dolarhyde is dealing with all of this, Graham, he makes the connection that the killer finds these families through these videotapes, and so he realizes that this is where the killer works. And from here, they are able to figure out that Francis Dolarhyde is the killer. And then from here, all 3 have slightly different endings, so I'm going to talk about them separately, beginning with the book. So in the book, Dolarhyde sees that Will is at his place of work, and Will has been in the papers that he's investigating these crimes. And so when Dolarhyde sees him, he knows that they are onto him. And again, prior to this, because his desire to save Reba, he had been thinking of committing suicide. However, because he's delusional and he thinks the dragon is a separate entity, he's like, you know what, if I kill myself though, Reba's life is still at risk because the dragon, he's separate from me now, so he could still kill her. And so he tries to become one with the dragon by literally eating the original painting. And after this, he then kidnaps Reba and he ends up shooting himself. He takes her to his house and he ends up shooting himself after he had set the house on fire. And so Reba makes it out alive. And right then the cops show up and she tells them that his dead body is in the house. And so it seems now that all is well. The killer has been killed. And so Will goes back to Florida. However, turns out Dolarhyde did not shoot himself, and he had shot this other guy whose body he had in the house, but he himself actually made it out alive. However, the investigators don't realize this until sometime later when they're going through the rubble and they look at his bones and they realize the DNA wasn't the DNA of Dolarhyde. But by the time they realize this, Dolarhyde is in Florida at Will's home and he attacks Will and his family, but Will and his family are able to come out of this alive and they are able to kill Dolarhyde. And then the 2002 movie, it's basically the same as the book up until Dolarhyde shows up in Florida. So here, Dolarhyde, he gets Will's son and is threatening the son's life, but Will, he knows that Dolarhyde was abused as a boy, and so he says abusive, mean things to his own son as a way to trigger this trauma within Dolarhyde. And this works, and Dolarhyde becomes kind of protective in a way of the boy, and Will is just able to throw Dolarhyde off enough that the boy is able to escape Dolarhyde, and from here, a shootout ensues and Dolarhyde ends up dead. And then Manhunter is a little different. So here, Dolarhyde does not know that they are onto him because he does not see Will at his place of business the way he did in the book in Red Dragon. And also, it doesn't seem like he thinks the dragon is some sort of separate entity here. And in many ways, they kind of downplay the dragon aspect in Manhunter. And also in the book in 2002 movie, we see that he has this dragon tattooed on his back. Whereas in Manhunter, apparently, they had scenes where we saw this tattoo, but then it was never shown in the official final cut of the film. But what happens instead is that Dolarhyde goes to see Reba and he sees her with another man and he sees them getting very close and it seems like they're being intimate and romantic with each other. And so this of course upsets Dolarhyde and he gets very jealous and he feels betrayed. However, the audience, when we see these two people together, it does look like they're having this romantic moment with each other. However, we realize that that is actually how Dolarhyde had been interpreting it. Like that's how he perceived the two of them. But then we cut to what they were really like, and actually the guy was just like taking some pollen off of her face. And so it wasn't a romantic, intimate moment, but the way Dolarhyde perceived it, he did think it was romantic. And so he gets very jealous and upset. And so he kills this guy, and then he kidnaps Reba and takes her back to his home. And he is about to kill her when then Will and the police show up right in time, and they are able to save Reba's life, and Dolarhyde is killed. And like I said, it does seem like they downplay the dragon aspect here. However, when Dolarhyde is shot, the way the blood is like coming from his body, he kind of starts to resemble the dragon, which I thought was a cool touch. And now to move on to more specific details of the book and the movies. So beginning with Hannibal Lecter. So in the book in Manhunter, we hear how Will, back before he caught Hannibal Lecter, he was investigating these murders, and he was meeting up with Lecter because Lecter was the psychologist to at least one of the victims. And so he was meeting with him as a way to better understand the victim and try to figure out the killer's motives. And while he is with him at one point in his office, he sees a book Lecter has on like war wounds, and the wounds in that reflect wounds on one of the victims. And so in that moment, he realizes like, this guy is the killer. And then from here, Lecter is caught and arrested. And in Manhunter, we are told this story, whereas in the 2002 version, we actually see it play out, and this is how the movie starts. And I loved that we actually see it take place, which I was totally expecting, right? Because for one, the big draw here for the 2002 movie is Anthony Hopkins. And so of course, they're going to use him as much as possible. And so they actually show us this scene, which I did like. However, they make the change that Will is talking to Lecter because Lecter is like a forensic psychologist, and they're working on like a killer profile together. And so I thought that was an odd change. I preferred it in the book where Lecter had been a psychologist to one of the victims. But anyway, as in the book, he realizes that Lecter is the killer, and ultimately he is arrested. But what's funny about Manhunter is I don't recall them ever specifically saying that Lecter was a cannibal. In the book, of course, we know this, and in the 2002 movie, of course, they talk about this. But yeah, unless I missed it, I don't recall them ever actually saying that. All we hear is that he was killing college girls, and that's it. So I thought it was interesting that they chose to omit that detail. And in all versions, Dolarhyde sees in the paper that Will is talking to Lecter to get help on this latest case. And so Dolarhyde sees this, and he's of course very flattered because, Lecter is someone he really admires. And so he writes a note to Hannibal Lecter wanting to start up a correspondence with him. And they find this note in Lecter's cell. And I think it's pretty clear in all versions that Lecter wanted this note to be found. But anyway, in this note, the Tooth Fairy says how he wants to start a correspondence with Lecter, and he says that the way Lecter can message him is by putting something up in the personal column of the newspaper. And so they get the note that Lecter has submitted to be put in the paper, but it is in code. And so they're like, we can either go ahead and print it anyway or print our own message. And ultimately they decide to go ahead and let the paper print Lecter's message. However, after it's been printed, they decode it and they realize that Lecter was giving the Tooth Fairy Will's home address in Florida. So now the killer knows where Will lives. And in the book in Red Dragon, this is how Dolarhyde knows where to go in the very end when he shows up in Florida. And in the book and Manhunter, Lecter gives him tidbits here and there to help on the case, but it's not like he helps him out a ton. Whereas in the 2002 movie, Lecter is giving Will all kinds of info and help. And some of what he says in this movie actually had been said by the police psychologist in the book, or the FBI psychologist that they were working with. And then also some of the other things that Lecter tells him in this movie, in the book, they were things that Will just found out on his own. And so by having Lecter give him so much assistance, it seemed to downplay the way Will can put himself in the heads of killers. Like without Lecter here in this version, Will might not have even found the killer, right? Because Lecter was giving him so much help and advice. And then also, like I said, in the book and Manhunter, Will decides he wants to go see Lecter. Like, yeah, sure, he wants some advice, but ultimately, like I said, he wants to get in that headspace, right? He wants to go see a killer to kind of like get in that headspace again. Whereas in Red Dragon 2002, it is Will's boss who tells him like, maybe you should go see Lecter. I think he could help us on this. And so that is why Will goes to see him. And so I feel like it just made Will not seem as capable in this version. And then in the very end of the book, Lecter writes Will a letter. However, at this point, Will is in the hospital from the injuries he got from Dolarhyde. And so Crawford, his boss, he sees this letter and he knows who it's from. And he's like, you know what? I'm just going to take that because Will, he doesn't need to hear from this guy right now. And so he takes the letter. And so Will never actually reads it. Whereas in the 2002 adaptation, the movie ends with Will reading this letter, and then in Manhunter, they just get rid of the letter entirely. But yeah, like I said, some of the things Lecter tells him in the 2002 movie had actually been things that the psychologist had told him. And this change, again, I didn't like because I preferred it coming from the psychologist in the book, because a huge focus of this book is what a well-oiled machine this is, right? Like so many different departments with so many experts who are excellent in their field, and it was just incredible what they could deduce from the most minor thing, right? And that part when they are taking the note that the Tooth Fairy had written Lecter, when they're taking it through to the different departments to gather evidence, like it was such a great scene and such a great example again of the efficiency and all of these people again who are experts in their field and who are giving their best to this job. And so we had that in some ways with the psychologist too, because he was providing different information. Whereas yeah, then in Red Dragon, the movie, it's just different things coming from Lecter. And we do get the scene in the 2002 movie where they're taking this note through to the different departments, but it just didn't have the same feel as the book in Manhunter. And I even want to share a quote from the book about this, where at the end it reads, "In time he hoped he would remember the few good moments, the satisfaction of seeing people at work who were deeply committed to their skills." But to get into Will a bit more, so in all versions, we see how Will has similarities with the killers he hunts to some extent. And again, being able to put himself in their mind is a skill, but one that disturbs him. And in Manhunter and the book, he goes to see Lecter, and Lecter tells him, like, you know, the reason you were able to catch me is because we're so much alike. And this, of course, is something Will doesn't want to hear. And in both book and Manhunter, Will, he's trying to hurry and leave the room before Lecter can even finish the sentence. And Will is just feeling so disturbed by this. And Manhunter does such a great job portraying this scene, like his rush to leave, and then when he's running to leave the building, and then when he's outside and his like vision is off because he's just so stressed and disturbed. And yeah, anyway, it was just such a great scene. And there's also a scene in Manhunter when he's talking on the phone with Lecter, and the relaxed way they're both sitting down, like they were different and yet kind of similar to each other. And so again, just these like subtle moments mixed in with more obvious statements, again, highlighting the similarities Will kind of has with these people. And I have to talk about the scene in the book when he is watching the home videotapes of the two families who have been killed. And he is like, man, like everything the killer needed to know was on these home videotapes. And as the reader, you're like, yes, because the killer has seen these videotapes. This is how he finds them. And right as the reader is like yelling at Will to make this connection, Will does make the connection. And so it was very satisfying. And then this scene in Manhunter was absolutely incredible. So first of all, he's with Crawford, and Crawford is getting upset because I guess they're like having to work late. And so Will yells at him being like, hey, like you brought me here to help you with this case, and we are going to stay here and work as long as it takes. And we see that he has the tapes going on two different TVs, and while he is watching them, he is talking to himself, and he is like on the brink of piecing it together. And as Will is beginning to make the connection, Crawford can feel a shift like in the atmosphere, and he sees that Will is working his magic. He can see that Will is on the brink to making a huge break in the case, you know? And then yeah, from here, Will realizes that these tapes were made by the same company, which means that the killer worked at this company. And yeah, this scene in the movie, it was just so intense and like electrifying and exhilarating. And it was just, it was incredible. Like the combination of the actor who plays Will, his performance, the performance by Crawford, because as his expression changes, it like at first he's annoyed, and then he can see like, whoa, like something's happening right here. And then as well as the music that was playing, like, it was just fantastic. I don't want to like oversell it, but it was amazing. Whereas in the 2002 movie, they also have this scene, but they kind of ruined it yet again with their inclusion of Lecter. Because in this version, Lecter says something to Will. And whatever it is that Lecter has said, when Will is watching the movies, he's like, like Lecter told me to watch these movies because the key to all of it is in these tapes. And so it's due to something Lecter said that has Will watching these tapes, trying to figure out what the connection is. And so yeah, he makes the connection, but it was all thanks to Lecter. And so again, this movie just really downplayed Will's skill at putting himself in the shoes of the killer, and it really took away from the excitement of this scene because it's like, oh, it's all thanks to Lecter. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have even thought to be, looking into these videotapes. But then, yeah, to go on a bit more about Will's ability to go into the head of the killer. Again, this is a skill that's very helpful, but Will is also disturbed by this ability he has. And there is a part when he was walking through the home of the latest murders, and he starts thinking of Molly and Willie, his wife and stepson, and we then read, he did not want to think of Molly now. To do so was tasteless as well as distracting. Graham had a lot of trouble with taste. Often his thoughts were not tasty. There were no effective partitions in his mind. What he saw and learned touched everything else he knew. Some of the combinations were hard to live with, but he could not anticipate them, could not block and repress. His learned values of decency and propriety tagged along, shocked at his associations, appalled at his dreams. Sorry that in the bone area of his skull there were no forts for what he loved. He viewed his own mentality as grotesque but useful. And yeah, I thought the book did a great job showing that. But now I guess I should talk about the killer, Francis Dolarhyde, aka the Tooth Fairy, aka the Red Dragon. So in the book and in the 2002 movie, we hear more about his childhood, whereas in Manhunter, that's never something that really comes up. But in the 2002 movie, we see that he lives in a house that used to be used as a nursing home. And we see that he has a painting of his grandmother, and we also see that he wears her dentures. Although I don't know if it's explicitly said like these are her dentures, but yeah, he wears his grandma's dentures. And we also have a scene where we hear in his mind the abuse his grandma would inflict on him. And so we see all of these things in the 2002 movie, but these were also all things that we delved into even more in the book. And again, it's like, I think it's implied in the movie that he wears his grandma's dentures. But in the book, we learn that, yeah, after his grandma died, he kept her dentures and he would wear them, but they like kind of fit weird in his mouth. And so he had a new pair made of her teeth that would fit in his mouth correctly. And he will wear these when he does the murders. And so the grandma, she had messed up teeth. And so the bite is very specific. And so the FBI has created a mold of this bite as a way to be like, oh, these are what his teeth look like. So this will help us catch the killer because it's a very unique teeth placement. However, ultimately this doesn't help because these aren't even Dolarhyde's real teeth, right? They're just the dentures of his grandma that he's wearing. And he himself was born with teeth issues and different deformities with his mouth. And so we hear in the book how he has a few different reconstructive surgeries when he is a child. And yet even with these surgeries, he's very self-conscious about his face. And that is why he always breaks the mirrors in the homes of the people he kills, but also in his own home, his mirrors are broken. And I did love the part in the 2002 movie when Reba is at his house. It's just so creepy because we see the shattered mirror and the cup with the dentures and just how creepy this place is. And yet Reba is totally unaware of it all because she is blind. And so it was just such an unsettling scene when she's in that bathroom. And then, yeah, so he thinks he is becoming the Red Dragon, which is this like creepy painting that was done based on the Book of Revelations. But yeah, so he thinks he's becoming that, but then like I said, it becomes a separate entity at one point. And so then when he goes to eat the original painting in order to become one with it, he is surprised at how small the actual painting is. And we read, he had never realized how much strength the dragon drew from the old house in the orchard. Because of course, his past trauma and abuse, that is what fuels this delusion he has, right? It's not actually the painting, it's like all of this past trauma and everything, right? And so this house he is choosing to stay living in is filled with all of these bad vibes and bad memories. And that is what is giving the dragon its power, you know? And then I gotta talk about Freddy Lounds, the seedy reporter who is harassing Will. So he harassed Will during the Lecter case. And then during the Tooth Fairy case, he's also hanging around trying to get information to put in his newspaper. And in all versions, they agree to talk to Lounds about the Tooth Fairy as a way to lure the fairy to them and catch him. However, this does not go as planned, and instead, Dolarhyde kidnaps Lounds and he kills him. And in all versions, he sets Lounds on fire in a wheelchair. But in the book, after this, Lounds lives for a little bit longer, like, you know, maybe a few hours longer. But he is able to tell them the license plate number of the van Dolarhyde was driving. And he also is alive long enough to say how he blames Will, basically. And he's like, Will set me up. And while both movies do have the Lounds character and have his death, they do not have him survive for a few hours after. And in the 2002 movie, Lounds is played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, which was great casting. And Hoffman, he was just always amazing in every movie he was person, and he was better than the Lounds in the 80s movie, I would say. But honestly, this was the only casting improvement because aside from Lounds, I think everybody was better in Manhunter. And again, I know that sounds harsh, but I stand by it. And before wrapping up, I also need to talk about Will's family. So we see that Will has a wife and a son. In the book, the son is his stepson because Molly had been married before, but that husband has died. So in the book, the son's name is Willie. Which, what was Thomas Harris thinking? We have a main character named Will, and then this other character named Willie. I feel like it's always a bad idea to have two characters with similar names, let alone the same name. But both of the movies change the son's name. But anyway, in the book it is his stepson. In the movies, I'm not quite sure. It might have been his biological son. But regardless, it doesn't really matter because he treats him like his own son in all versions. But yeah, when Lecter gives the Tooth Fairy Will's address, they have Molly and Willie come up to stay with Will so that they will be safe and protected. And then in the movie Red Dragon, from here, like, that's all we see of Molly. Like, we know that they're both there up where Will is and they're safe, and that's basically it up until the end. But in the book in Manhunter, Molly ends up leaving this area and going to stay with family out of state. But it's very different because in Manhunter, Will suggests this. Whereas in the book, Molly is the one that's like, you know what? We're going to go stay somewhere else. And while she is away, it really wears on their relationship and it becomes very tense between the two of them. And then at the end, when they're in Florida and Dolarhyde attacks. So in the 2002 movie, as well as in the book, Molly is the one who gives Dolarhyde like his fatal shot. And so she is directly involved in this. And it is, of course, very traumatic. And when Will wakes up in the hospital, he learns that Molly and the son have gone back to, it's in Oregon. So they're back in Oregon with this other extended family. And in the book, it is ambiguous on whether or not they will even get back together in the end. Whereas in the 2002 movie, we see him with Molly and his son, and they're out like on a boat and they seem to be doing fine. And then in Manhunter, we also see them together at the end, although we do see just like the emotional toll this has had on Molly. But ultimately, they are still on good terms, unlike the book. But also in this movie, before they had left, he had been setting up like some kind of fence for baby turtles that were about to hatch. And at the very end, the son, he's like, oh, did all of them make it out alive? Meaning the baby turtles. And Will tells him, like, most of them did. And I like this because it seems to be referencing the characters in the story, right? Because most of the people made it out alive and they caught the killer, but there were some people who still died, right? And so I love that line when he's like, most of them did. And then from here, we see the three of them on the beach. And yeah, they seem to be doing great. But when it comes to book versus movies, so first of all, let's get the obvious out of the way and officially say that 2002 Red Dragon comes in at last place. And by the way, something else I wanted to mention, like I mentioned the scene when Lecter's on the phone talking to a secretary. This is when he is getting Will's address. Again, if you watch those two scenes, the one in Manhunter is so much better. But also the scene when Dolarhyde, he takes Reba to pet a sedated tiger. And again, if you watched these two scenes from each film, the Manhunter version is so much better. And she is listening to the tiger's heartbeat. And in the 2002 movie, she is using a stethoscope. Whereas in Manhunter, she is laying on top of the tiger, listening to his heartbeat. And just that right there is a great example of the difference between these two movies. Like, having her lying on the tiger, listening to its heart was so much better than having her listen with a stethoscope, right? It felt so much more distanced and sterile or something, But yeah, so as far as book versus movie goes, this is between the book and the movie Manhunter. But this is really tough between these two because I really did love each of them. And the book has things I loved that weren't in the movie. For example, we get snippets from like different random characters who aren't part of the main plot, but they relate to the main plot in one way or another. And so just these random conversations we get just made the world this is happening in feel so much more realized. And then I did also like hearing Dolarhyde's backstory, and we see too more of he and Reba because in Manhunter, the relationship with Reba definitely feels rushed a bit. And then also the influence of the dragon and his past abuse that was much more fleshed out in the book than it was in Manhunter. And yet, the movie is amazing as it is too. And even the things they cut or the things they rush through, like they don't have these side conversations with random characters. And we don't hear about Dolarhyde's past, and his relationship with Reba feels rushed. And yet I'm also fine with all of those changes, and I can understand why they made those changes too, right? And also, I like in the movie that they do focus more on Will. Like, we still get stuff from Dolarhyde's perspective, but most of the movie, I would say, we're with Will, whereas the book, it feels pretty evenly split between the two. And I personally preferred the parts with Will. And so, yeah, so I was happy with the movie making the choice to focus even more on him while still including some Dolarhyde segments. And then, yeah, so many great scenes from the book. The movie just nails, and they just show it so well, and in some ways it just elevates the scene even more. And so yeah, as far as which one wins, this is really tough. Initially, I was thinking the book because, oh man, yeah. I did love the book, and again, I do want to read more by Thomas Harris. But yeah, then the movie, they do make some changes, but for the most part, I do think it's a good adaptation. And then yeah, the movie just has so many incredible scenes. So this is really tough. I feel like I've been picking the movie a lot lately, and I think I'm going to pick the movie again, and I'm going to say Manhunter wins over the book Red Dragon, but it's such a close call. They're both so good. If you like one, you should definitely check out the other. So that wraps it up for Red Dragon and Manhunter. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you to those who recommended this, because this was not on my radar at all, but it is thanks to a few different people commenting their thoughts or just straight up requesting it. So it is thanks to them that I even covered this. And so yeah, thank you again for requesting this one, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time. Bye.